All right, we're back. I'll try to beat the 12 minutes and 39 seconds from the other video that I just made. All right, so the next one we're going to look at is called total fertility rate. So TFR is oftentimes what you'll see. So right here it says FR, fertility rate. Okay, so that definition is the number of children per woman of childbearing age. So what is childbearing age, you ask? We're speaking in kind of a biological perspective. So oftentimes, I think 15 to 49 are the age ranges that are given, but the number of children per woman of childbearing age. So you'll notice the numbers. So this is kind of an average per the country. So blue areas are areas that would have low fertility rates. Blue, bluish green. And then as we get into green, yellow, red, purple, those are countries that are going to have examples of kind of mid-level or high fertility rates. So these are pretty highly correlated with birth rates, right? When you think about it, it makes sense that those are kind of two different spins on the same general idea. So an example of a country with a lower fertility rate would be a country like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, we see here. As we get into Eastern Europe again, we see countries that have really low fertility rates, around 1 or 1.2 or 1.3. So basically, when you think about it, the standard replacement level fertility rate is about 2 or 2.1. So that means that for every 2 people it takes to have a kid, they would essentially, if they have 2, that they're essentially replacing themselves from like a biology perspective. So if you think about it, 2 is kind of the magic number for population growth. And really, I think 2.1 is, for some reason, I forget why. Maybe we'll talk about it in class. Yeah, so those are low examples. And then as we get higher, we see some purple on the map. So these countries here that you see, you have Mali, let's see, Chad, Niger. So some interesting examples of countries that have really high fertility rates. Essentially, they have fertility rates that are in kind of 6 children per woman or 7 children per woman. Oftentimes, these are also places that kind of, when we talk about infant mortality rate, you'll see have high infant mortality rates as well. So choose a country that is in sub-Saharan Africa or kind of otherwise purple or yellow or orange, and they are an example of a country that have a high fertility rate. All right, so the next statistic that we're going to look at is called infant mortality rate, and it's pretty highly correlated with the last statistic that we talked about. So infant mortality rate is within a country per 1,000 live births. How many children do not survive their first year? So this is obviously a really sad statistic and a sad thing to think about. And it is essentially very highly correlated with how many children people have, because when people tend to have more children when they do not have the confidence that children will survive their first few years of births. So again, you see high infant mortality rates are highly correlated to being in high and less developed parts of the world. So one of the first thing that countries do when they develop, it seems like, is to lower their infant mortality rates, and that makes sense. So less developed countries oftentimes have really high infant mortality rates. So you can see some examples within the map. So a country like Afghanistan that has a lot of turbulence and war and lack of development kind of in different parts of the country is an example of a country that still has a high infant mortality rate. And then a country that most of the blue, you can basically pick a blue country, and that's an example of a country that has a low infant mortality rate. So a lot of reasons for this. It can do with lack of maternal health care, oftentimes is one of the biggest signifiers for infant mortality. Food insecurity, child malnutrition, all of those things are lack of access to medicine. All of those things are kind of equated or correlated with high infant mortality rates. All right, so the next statistic, second to last statistic, is called life expectancy. So this one has a little bit higher, or a little bit longer definition. It's the average number of years a person can be expected to live given current social, economic, and medical conditions. So it's kind of interesting. Life expectancies are in many ways kind of a projection, more so than an average. But there's a lot of math that goes into it. So think about countries that have low and high life expectancies. So some good. So in kind of going back to talking about infant mortality rates, some of the really good news in the world in the past 30 or 40 years has to do with the um, huge decrease that we've seen in infant mortality rates. So just about everywhere around the world, infant mortality rates have gone way, way, way down. And obviously, they're still way too high in some places, but they've gone down all across the world. And on the flip side of that, we have seen life expectancy go way, way, way up in just about every part of the world. So we'll look at a graph in a second. You'll just see exactly what I mean. But nowadays, we have life expectancies that in some places are kind of pushing 90, which is interesting. You're starting to see, I think, Singapore, Iceland, Japan, females are starting to live to, or the life expectancy for females is pushing kind of 89 and 90. So really interesting in terms of the longevity of life going up across the world. So any country that you see purple here would be a country with a high life expectancy. And then still relatively lower life expectancies in kind of the patchwork of sub-Saharan Africa that we see. So like I said, there's a lot of really, really good news because life expectancies in this region of the world have gone up more than just about anywhere else in the world. But you still see it kind of lagging behind. An example would be a country like this Democratic Republic of the Congo right here that we see. And you can see Afghanistan as well up here, still lagging behind its neighbors in life expectancy. So, and kind of a pictorial representation of what I was just talking about, we've seen from 1950 just about every region of the world, life expectancy has essentially skyrocketed and gone way, way up because getting rid of things like a lot of the diseases and a lot of the sort of negative checks on population that have happened. And the flip side is you've seen population growth happening as well. So that's kind of people living longer, people, things like that going on at the same time. So life expectancy is really interesting. And we're going to look at a couple maps of the United States to see. So even within, so the United States as a whole, if you're looking at our average life expectancy, it's usually somewhere around 76 or 77, 78. But it changes pretty significantly based on where you live in the United States. So I always think this is a really interesting map to look at and to think about. But you have a range essentially. So this is a map that the scale is global, but the scale of analysis is by county. So you can see essentially where people live, or where life expectancy is the highest and where life expectancy is the lowest. So let's talk about where we see blue first. So you'll notice the coasts tend to be more blue than parts of the inland, with some pretty significant exceptions, and also cities. So people tend to live longer in cities than they do in rural areas. So we definitely see that as well. So most of the time when you see a blue dot in the midst of a state, it's kind of the big city in the state. So an example would be like Nashville, Tennessee. I used to live in Nashville, so I know a little bit about it, but lots and lots of hospitals, lots of good universities, things like that, and a much higher life expectancy than the rest of Tennessee. So some interesting kind of connections you can see with the blue areas. And then the red areas. So some places to think about, or some things to think about, is how ethnicity, how kind of geography can affect life expectancy. So 3 areas that jump out to me as being red are this area of Kentucky and West Virginia that we would call Appalachia. Basically kind of poor mountain towns with really high rates of poverty. So lots and lots of poverty, and relative lack of access to medicine, healthcare, things like that. Another area that would stick out to me would be this Mississippi Delta region that we have here. So unlike Appalachia, which is predominantly white, this area would be predominantly African American, and you see a huge kind of the huge area of land that kind of with high concentrations of poverty here. So a lot of historical and economic reasons why this part of the world or why this part of the country is poorer than other parts of the country. But you just see kind of the lack of access to healthcare, medicine, things like that. So just like when we think about lack of development in other parts of the world, you have parts of the United States where there's lack of access to medicine and lack of access to healthcare and things like that that help people be healthier. And then the last one that I think is interesting and sad, but worth talking about and thinking about are kind of within South Dakota. You can see most of the red areas within South Dakota are native, kind of correspond to Native American reservations. So you can see how oftentimes lower areas with low life expectancies can be correlated to areas that are predominant ethnic group. And some reasons, kind of cultural and economic reasons why Native Americans on reservations don't have as much access to healthcare or other things that would help improve life expectancies. So I think that's really interesting to see kind of across the scale of the United States, different, just how much things are different from place to place. And similarly, it's interesting to look within Seattle. So not just within the United States, you can see differences within kind of at a local scale as well. So this is by neighborhood level, but you can see how much life expectancy is different across Seattle as well. So you have an area down here. I think this is just for men too. But kind of below Auburn, where you have life expectancies that are around 68 to 71. And then you have other areas around Bellevue that have 84 and up. So interestingly, oftentimes kind of the economic status of a place and life expectancy are really, really highly correlated, especially in the United States, where access to healthcare is correlated with economic status sometimes. So, and here we are over here within the 80 to 83 range. All right, so last one is dependency ratio. So this one is defined as the number of people who are too young or too old to work compared to the number of people in their productive years. All right, so this is kind of a weird one. And you know, people can be productive. I know lots of people that are pretty productive that are 15 or below, have jobs, and I know a lot of people that are super productive and over 65 and have jobs. And I know a lot of people that are not that productive between their 15 and 65. But basically, from an economic standpoint, they judge as kind of it's useful to look at how many people within a country are essentially being supported by the economic class or the economic age groups within a country. So it's interesting to look at basically what percentage of the country is below 15, what percentage of the country is over 65, and that has some interesting economic and social implications for a country. So just to look at and to think about this, we see what we're going to see a lot of in the next couple of weeks, which are population pyramids. So this is your first taste of population pyramids. But on the left-hand side, we have a country that is less developed and has a really, really high youth dependency ratio. So essentially, they have a lot of people that are under the age of 15. So when you think about this statistic, think about some issues that would exist within a country that has a really, really, really high rate of younger people. So you might have a lack of access to education within the country. You might have a lack of access to healthcare for citizens under 15. You might have a working class that is not conceivably big enough to support kind of the high number of kids that exist within a country. And you also have lower life expectancy. So you have not as many people surviving to kind of balance out the pyramid. So you can see that on the left-hand side with Uganda. And then on the other hand, we have a more developed country like Germany. So as you'll notice, you can see the population pyramid kind of shrinking a little bit after we get past the boomers here and the middle age. We're going to talk a lot about boomers this unit in an academic context. So after we get past that age group, you can see the population pyramid tends to go down. It starts to decrease. but it still has a really high percentage of older people within the country. So this would be an example of a country that has a high elder dependency ratio. So this is not necessarily a bad thing. Obviously, it means people are living a long time, so higher life expectancies. So these tend to be more developed countries, but it still comes with its fair share of problems. You have to older people oftentimes have increased healthcare needs, and there are similar concerns about are there enough people within the economically active age groups to support older people within the country. You might also have things like lots of people cash in social security checks and things like that that are might affect the government and how it functions. So there are kind of 4 different statistics in here. So you might want to write down a country like Uganda would be an example of a country with a high youth dependency ratio and a low elder dependency ratio. And a country like Germany would be an example of a country like that has a high elder dependency ratio and a low youth dependency ratio. All right, I think I've taken enough of your time, so hopefully you come back with all of this done. I didn't make my 12-minute mark. I'm sorry. Bye.